Hello, welcome along to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. This week we're chatting to Nayantara Roy, whose new book is The Magnificent Ruins. It's out across the world right now. Nayantara works across storytelling in all forms of her work, really. She's also a TV executive for the channel Starz over in LA. We discuss that and being submersed in discovering good stories, and how, through all that, what she's learned about how she works best.
Rest, or the gift of time to yourself, is such a hard thing to come by for millennials who live in busy cities. I fantasize often about living as some of your guests do, somewhere beautiful that sort of nourishes you and fuels the creative process. But I think for the most part, what works for me is the silent early hours and really not being interrupted and having the freedom to play a little bit.
And you can hear how a childhood growing up across the world has given her, hopefully, a deep understanding of how to write character.
I've met, at this point, hundreds of human beings from all walks of life, from all ethnicities, as people like me would. And it's shaped my thinking because every one of those people have sort of, had a different story. And my characters in my novels are frequently people of my generation with a certain acute loneliness that comes of living in the big city and being from elsewhere, but also having found new homes within the families they've created from friendships and landlords and workplaces and lovers.
It's all on the way with Nayantara Roy in this week's Writer's Routine. This week's episode is sponsored by Faber Academy, whose flagship course is back. If you missed the chance to take part in this in autumn, when they supported the show, you can get involved in 2025 now. It's back. Maybe this could be a Christmas present to your creative self. It's the Writing a Novel course that you can get into in person if you're in the UK, online if you're further afield. It's a 6-month-long programme of sessions, and it covers all the essentials of novel writing: character, story, structure, plotting, voice, dialogue, the whole thing. Now, this podcast lets you hear from the best authors around. That's what I'm in this for, to inspire you, to plan your day, to take tips and advice from the best, to craft your idea. So that's what this podcast does. And this course takes it one step further, because over 150 graduates from the Writing a Novel course have gone on to secure a publication deal. Some big names in there too. Maddie Mortimer, who published Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies. S.J. Watson, who wrote Before I Go to Sleep, that was turned into a huge movie a few years ago. Through the course, you'll hear from guest speakers, some of the biggest names in publishing, authors, editors too. It's designed to help hone your craft and help you find direction. And if you're a fan of the podcast, if you've heard a lot of the episodes that we've done, you'll know that so many authors we've spoken to cannot speak highly enough about the Faber Academy. And now it's your chance to be one of them. At the end of the course, part of your work is sent out to agents across the UK. It gives you the best chance of being in a position to get your work out there. There are courses online that start from the 20th of January, and then in London, in the day or in the evening, you can get involved on the 28th of January. So if you missed it in autumn, make the most of it through 2025 with the Faber Academy Writing a Novel course. They are sponsoring the show for a little while. Find out more, faberacademy.com/writing-a-novel. Search online for it, and we've got the link in the episode notes wherever you're listening. So welcome to the show. This is Writer's Routine, where we take a look inside an author's working day. We see how they plan their lives to give them the best chance of getting their plot down to hopefully publish it. My name's Dan Simpson. This week we're joined by Nayantara Roy. Nayantara works in telly over in LA. Love a bit of that for the channel Starz. Her journey to the States took her all over the world, really. Born in India, she's lived in South Africa and the UK. We talk about that mix of culture, how it's influenced the novels that she writes. The debut is The Magnificent Ruins. It's all about Lila, who is on the verge of a career breakthrough when she learns that her grandfather has left her enormous family home in Kolkata to her. And for the first time in years, she returns to a place teeming with memories of a strange childhood. And she has to deal with everything that comes with that, with her family who are still living there and who are resenting the fact that it's now hers. And old flames emerge, and they force Lila to come to terms with her past and reckon with her inherited custom of sweeping everything under the rug and forgetting. We discuss why she wrote it early in the morning and the fact that it was fairly unplanned, and how that fact has changed the way that she's plotting and planning future novels. You can hear why, even though she's got an office to write in, she tends to just stick to the comfortable sanctuary of her couch. We discuss her vision of what's happening down the line in her writing career. How prepared is she for perhaps a position of success when more books need to get done every single year? How is she going to fit that around family life, around work life? What's she going to do if the dream actually happens? You can hear, and Nayantara explains this really well, how she remembers that characters are thoughts, how they're actions, their emotions, their deeds. They're not just a two-dimensional idea. How does she keep that front and centre all of the time? We'll get into it. There's loads to discuss with Nayantara Roy, and we start, as we always do, with what she sees around her in the place where she sits down to write.
I'm in my living room. It's early. There are my bookshelves behind me. They're filled. We have too many books. I'm not allowed to buy any more, but that'll never happen. I start my day on this white couch that is backed up against a glass wall, and it kind of looks out into Silver Lake, which means that I have a nice view of some palm trees and usually a sunny blue sky, but today it's British weather. And I can see my tomato plants from where I sit, and that's where I start to think about writing.
I know that you work in telly, in TV, and you do that on the other side of Los Angeles from where you live, really. So when you are writing and working at home, how much thought went into kind of making the space as perfect as it could be, because you've not got a lot of time to write in, and you must be exhausted from all the travelling and the working, and it needs to be just right for you. How much thought went into that?
It's interesting. Not much at all. We have a 3-bedroom apartment, so that just means that one of the rooms functions as my partner's office. He works from home. The other is our bedroom, and the third was going to be where I wrote, but I really found myself gravitating towards this one couch that I have. When we moved in together, my fiance brought his couch, which is the bigger of the two, and I wanted to keep my couch as well. It somehow fit into our living room, which isn't that big, but it works. And I find myself really gravitating towards this white couch that I wrote all of my first novel on, and, where I look out and I feel completely at home with my writing. It's a little inconvenient because after the early morning hours, if I have a day off, it's a little more bustling than I would like. And eventually, I would like to either convert the guest bedroom into my office or have an office, but it really works for me right now.
Why do you think that is? Why, with the choice of perhaps having an office, do you feel most comfortable writing on a couch in your living room?
I think it's because of the hours that I write. One, I wake up really early. There's no other way to do it with the lifestyle I have. As you said, I have a day job. So, I'm really untouched by anyone else in those very early morning hours. And the view is really wonderful. I can look outside and sort of see trees and a sky, and it just empties my mind of everything else. But I think the biggest reason is that that couch has been with me for 15 years, through a lot of things, through my um, ability to give birth to a full novel, which I wasn't sure I would. And there's something about the way the couch shapes around me, or I settle myself into it, that just readies me.
Is there anything around you that's more practical? So post-it notes and planning, or is it just you on the couch with your laptop?
I do, when I start a novel, have post-it notes that are haphazard, an idea here, a note there. I have a post-it note stuck to my monitor at work that reminds me that characters are, not analysis. They're what they think and how they behave. But I wouldn't say that I have your classic writer's whiteboard, with the scenes lined up, or or pieces of dialogue on it. I just don't have that luxury yet, not having a formal office. But so far, it's worked for me.
It's interesting that you refer to you don't have that yet. So there is this vision of down the line you'll be able to have your perfectly curated writing space, your own office. What have you got in mind for that? What does it need to have in there?
And I should say that right next to my beautiful little white couch is a beautiful little ceramic table that holds several beverages, a cup of tea, water, ice water, that kind of thing. And I need all of that to start my day. So I think my perfect space would be, just because I've written on the couch through my sort of graduate school days and then after, I would want a couch. But I think I'd want a formal desk and a chair, and the view would be really important to me. There's something about looking out into nature and an empty sky that really sort of fills my brain with, it just rejuvenates me and has me ready to write. On your podcast, I've just heard so many authors, some in Scotland, some in the parts of the UK countryside, that are like, well, I wake up in the morning and I see this idyllic landscape, moors or mountains or the sea. And I'm like, well, I would love that. That would be great.
But you're doing that in Hollywood, really? That's pretty idyllic.
I mean, Silver Lake's no, Scottish countryside, but I do like it very much. It has really enriched my life to live somewhere where there's a bit of green. We have a backyard, and, I think it's really important to unplug in the city if you're going to write. And for me, nature is a big part of the way I do that.
As you know, we get a little bit technical on the show, a bit geeky. So if it is just you and your laptop, really, what software are you writing on? What strong, staunch font opinions do you have?
You're going to hate this, but I do use a Google Doc to sort of map out. I always start with outline. So in that sense, I'm very much a plotter. But the idea will sort of present itself to me at some point over years. And the way I've come to my second novel is an idea that germinated, and, I've just written slowly over a period of time. I think for me, that first step, writing it down in a notebook, outlining it, I write by hand initially, and then I switch to the Google Doc. And it's usually just the basic font, the Calibri, or, I think it's Calibri, and it's at 11 or 12, but I'm pretty regimented with that. I don't change it around. And then once I've finished with outline, and I don't hard and fast stick to outline, it shapes and shifts. I talk to my agent sometimes. I have an editor now. It's very important for me to have a working base in that outline, but then the story transforms. And so when that does, the outline does as well.
It's interesting hearing you talk about obviously, we'll cover this way more onwards. But the process of the first one and the second one was a bit, I guess, free-forming. You were allowing the story and the idea to germinate. You were giving it time. Should your writing career be as successful as you'd like, and this is what you do, and you are getting books out at a fairly quick rate, how prepared are you to make that process a bit more forced because of a time pressure? Maybe you won't have a long time to let things percolate before you need to get writing.
Yeah, it's a really good question. But I will preface by saying I'm pretty A-type. It's not like I burden myself to, have pages every day. Well, I wouldn't say burden, but it's not like I impose upon myself the burden to sort of have pages every day that must contribute to the novel. But I work every day. I once read somewhere that if you edited 5 pages a day for 5 days a week, or wrote 500 words a day for 5 days a week, and some combination of that, your novel would get done. And it gave me a lot of peace because I don't have much time, but the time that I do, I really want to focus. So whether or not those 500 words contribute to the final novel, I allow myself that time. And I think if I was someone who just wrote novels, there's no other way for me to make it good than to spend that time really thinking about what I want intentionally those 500 words to be versus sort of, and sometimes that happens as well, where you've written 12 pages in a row and you look up and you're astounded by it. But I think I never want to, and this is very presumptuous because who knows what I never or will do at some point, but I just do want to make sure that I have the time to think as I write, and that's not an impractical thing because I think so much of what the work of being a writer or a novelist, especially in literary fiction, is to really understand how your characters are shaping up, who they're becoming as you're letting yourself work on the page versus sort of rushing into it too quickly.
Does that thinking you say as you're writing, is that literally happening as you are typing away? Or is it happening? Have you stepped away? Have you given yourself time to be, I'm not going to write anything. I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to meditate. I'm going to think about these characters. At what point is that happening?
I wouldn't say that I do a lot of sitting there thinking about the characters. I mean, things about the characters will strike me at different points in the day. I have a long commute. I can't tell you how many times I've had a thought about a character that sort of bloomed and I've later made note and come back to it in the morning when I write. But really, the work of those couple of hours that I do write, I'm writing. It's not always things that make itself into the novel, but I'm writing. I'm sometimes doing an exercise. There's a character in my second book that I, understood from my agent and from other readers, wasn't sort of having as much agency as we needed him to have. And I did a lot of work around him. I sort of, tried to inhabit him, tried to think about the person that he was. And as abstract as that sounds, you sort of ask a lot of questions around this person and what makes them act the way they do. Because in novels, people act in surprising ways. And it worked because for a period of time, I wasn't really writing so much as writing him. And that was a separate exercise from the novel. And then when I was writing his words and his scene, additional dialogue in the novel, it came more in a more fully formed manner.
You said earlier on when we were talking about post-it notes that you have something going on at work that reminds you characters are thoughts and feelings in actions rather than just a one two-dimensional idea. What is it on those post-it notes that's reminding you that?
It changes, you know. I will write something that sort of helps remind me of what I want to be sure of as I'm writing, and that can change through different parts of the novel. Right at this moment, and this hasn't changed for a good number of months, maybe 6 or more. It is a post-it that says, characters are the sum of what they're feeling and the things they say, and not their analysis of the world. You know, and that's something that I needed to remind myself, because the second book, as I was writing it, is a truly internal character, but the things that happen to her aren't necessarily internal. They are, you know, momentous events, and how does an internal person or a more passive person navigate that? I wake up, my little dog is curled up at my feet at some point, so I try not to move him as I slide out of bed, try not to wake my partner. It is usually very dark. I'm talking 4:45 a.m., maybe 5. The first thing I'll do is put the kettle on, splash some cold water on my face, put a serum, something like that. And then I'll drink the tea. I'll sit on the white couch, and I'll do morning pages. I'll just write in my journal, and I wouldn't call them morning pages in the way that I'm just pouring myself out, but I come to it with a desire to talk in my journal to myself about what I want to write and the things that have happened to me in the last 24 hours. I meditate 10 minutes only, and sometimes it's all over the place. My brain is filled with noise, and I know what the day is going to be like then. And sometimes my brain is clear and empty. It's usually when I've slept well. And those writing days are just better than others. And then it's pretty much, I would say that's around 6 o'clock that I'm ready, and I'll make another cup of tea, and I will write straight for 2.5 hours. I'm uninterrupted usually. Sometimes the doorbell will ring or something like that. But for the most part, I'm by myself. The light is changing because it either goes from darkness to, you know, sunrise, and then bright LA light. And something about that also sort of times me as I near the end of my writing period. And then I'll put in a quick workout and go get ready for my long commute to my day job.
So what time is that all finishing up then? What time are you starting the workout?
I'd say around 8:45. I'll start a quick workout. Around 9:15, I'll be done. I'm ready in 15-20 minutes, and then I'm on the road. And I'll get into work by about 10:30.
What's the aim of the day? You mentioned 500 words earlier. Is it that? Do you write to another objective?
I've stuck to that, yes, but I haven't written a new novel in a while. I'm editing my second novel, but it's usually 500 words a day of new material, or I edit 5 pages, and sometimes it's a combination of both those things. You know, I edit yesterday's work and I write a few more. Sometimes it is breaking through. I find myself stumped, right? There are weeks where you have a block of 5 days where you're just working on one little fiddly thing in the book, and you're not cracking it. You're not, and there is suddenly light at the end of a tunnel. And that happens to me every now and then. And I let myself have that room on the page. When I haven't let myself, and I've moved on, and I've heard other writers say this, that they can work sort of out of time, meaning they can jump around. I'll let this be, and I'll go to the next chapter and I'll come back to it. I am not that person. I need to understand what it is and figure it out and feel for myself who these people are before I move on with anything.
Because your work is more literary fiction, and you're writing 500 words, which, you know, isn't the biggest goal every day, but because you're not so genre led, how perfect do those 500 words need to be when you're writing? Are you trying to find something almost brand new and completely novel with every word that you type?
I would say that that's not, I don't give myself that imperative that it has to be perfect, because, you know, I have understood that perfect is really, you know, it's going to come at the end of the copy edit 4 years later, you know, if it does at all. So I would say it's not, you know, sometimes I'll write 5 pages and it's grammatically incorrect, but it's just poured out of me in a specific way. And then there are days that I write a perfect little paragraph, you know, and it has made its way into the novel as is. But for the most part, I think I let myself go a little bit as I'm writing new material. And then when I edit it the next day, I usually will edit it a little bit before moving on if I feel like it's wildly sort of, it's poured right out of my veins onto the page, and I haven't quite structured it. So I am a person who will clean up before I move on.
It's incredibly busy, right? You're doing this writing as a labor of love before you, and you have to wake up so early to get it done, and then you're off across the city working as an exec in TV. How much does one impact the other? If it's been a tricky morning writing, does that, if you're being honest, how much does that bleed across into your day job? If the day job is if it's hard, if it's tough at that point, how much is that impacting your ability to be creative at 5 a.m?
Plenty. I think the thing that most impacts me is if I have a late night, because I don't have trouble waking up if we're well rested, but, you know, and we have no children, which is a big thing. My partner works from home, and, you know, we'll walk the puppy when he wakes up. So it's not like I have responsibilities in the morning that other writers may have yet. And so it really is about wrapping up in time and not being overly indulgent with my morning, getting something done before I leave, right? But I will say, if it's been a tough day at work and, you know, you're mentally really exhausted and you've been to an event, a lot of my job involves, you know, talking to writers after hours, having drinks with them sometimes, events, panels, that kind of thing. I'm pretty precious with my weeknights when I'm really writing a novel, because the later I'm out, the more impossible it is for me to get anything done the next morning. So I try to, especially when I'm writing a new novel, not have much of that, but it's not always possible because that is my job.
When you were writing without a contract, so you didn't have that almost that justification to other people that you are also an author, you're a published author, right? Which is an excuse that people can't get away from. When you're just doing it off your own back, almost as a hobby, how how tricky was it to say no and to say I'm going home and to say I can't be out too late tonight?
I almost never did, but I was younger and more of a beast. You have a wild sort of fire in your veins in those early years. It took me 7 years to write my first novel, and I am yet to be a published author. It comes out November 12th in the US and December 5th in the UK. But I think what's sort of fueled me always is the knowledge that I was going to write a novel. I wasn't sure about when or how I would end up doing it, but I always knew that. I never stopped writing. I won a lot of prizes as a kid. And my cousin is a novelist. My grand aunt was a novelist. I wondered at what point I would be a novelist, and I was encouraged by my Asian dad to get a real job, which I did, and one that I love, preferably, which I did. But I think the novel was always brewing in me. And when I went to graduate school at Columbia University for film and TV, I ended up taking writing classes. And in one of those classes, it was called Other People's Secrets, and it was taught by the professor, Benjamin Taylor. And what came out of me at the end of that semester was a short essay about a mother and daughter, which eventually became the genesis of this larger novel, my first novel, The Magnificent Ruins. And I think I had always known that that was going to happen at some point, because then after that, the next novel, was another idea that I had germinated for a few years, and that kind of poured out of me more quickly in the space of a year and a half. So I wouldn't say that I've ever stopped thinking about writing. It just has been a matter of time a matter of time of when I ended up doing it.
Right. So where does, you've said where it comes from, but why is that still around? Why it's such an inconvenience to you having to wake up at 4:30 or whenever it is to start writing? You're creatively exhausted by the time you need to get to work, I would imagine. So where does that need come from? Was it a desire to specifically get this idea for The Magnificent Ruins out? Is it just some deep longing to have the accolade of being a published author?
No, I'm a writer. I think if I didn't have writing, I would be at a loss in my life. You're right. It is hard to make both work. But I wouldn't be who I am if I wasn't writing a novel or germinating one or trying to edit one. I've been that person for much longer than I've been anything else in my life. So even if nobody, I think I could go back to writing not on contract, even so desperate is my desire to write. I just hope I'll have an audience to do it for. And it isn't that hard for me. I wouldn't say I go to work creatively exhausted at all. I would say a good writing day fuels me in a way unlike other. And my day job involves me coming to books or screenplays or ideas as a creative and shaping them into series. That is not something that you can be creatively exhausted for. And I think I'm good at what I do. So there is this idea of one thing fueling the other versus sort of depleting your reserves.
More from Nayantara in just a second. If you're enjoying the show, if you would like to support us, and I know it's Christmas and there's a lot going on, there's a lot of outgoings, so I know that times are tight, but if you would like to support us, there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can support us every month with a regular donation on patreon.com/writers routine. For that, you get merch. There is bonus content. There is even a way for your book to sponsor this show. So if you've published something, if you think it deserves more shouting, let me do that for you. Patreon.com/writers routine. Just $1 or so a month. It will get you access to our writing community over there. I know that maybe you might not be comfortable with a regular monthly donation. That's absolutely fine. If you would still like to support the show, you can send a one-off tip to ko-fi.com/writers routine on Ko-fi. I've stuck the link in the episode notes for both of those wherever you're listening. Just a one-off tip, a donation of whatever you fancy. It goes an extraordinarily long way to helping me make the time to bring you these chats with the best authors around as often as possible. If you would like to support the show, I'd love you to do that over on Patreon and Ko-fi. You've got links wherever you're listening. Let's get back to it then with Nayantara Roy chatting about her new novel. It's the debut, The Magnificent Ruins. It sees Lila on the verge of a huge career breakthrough, return home to Kolkata and deal with everything that happens when you return home. We discuss the experience of writing the debut, how its lack of a plan has led her to perhaps plan and plot more through her second. Also, we hear why she learns as she goes, and there's a lot of learning, actually. You might have picked up Nayantara listens to the podcast. She takes in a lot of tips from here and through all sorts of different places about the craft of writing and how it can work and how it's different for everyone. So we get back into it, discussing what she's learned about the best way she does it.
I would say that I work best when I've had, as boring as it sounds, plenty of rest. And rest, or the gift of time to yourself, is such a hard thing to come by for millennials who live in busy cities. I fantasize often about living as some of your guests do, somewhere beautiful that sort of nourishes you and fuels the creative process. But I think for the most part, what works for me is the silent early hours and really not being interrupted and having the freedom to play a little bit as I write, and then, making a concerted, disciplined effort to finish what I've started. So whether it's a chapter or the whole book or an outline, I do set deadlines for myself and try to stick to them for the most part.
And just on that, before we move on to talk about the novel, you've kind of been all over, I think. So you're in LA now. It's right that you were born in India, you've lived in South Africa and in the UK as well. So that's what, four? Just four in that sentence, quite different places with different cultures, with completely different ways of doing things and of seeing the world. How has that impacted the writer that you are and the stories you tell?
Yeah. I mean, I moved around that much entirely as a product of my father's job. He had a job that required him to travel and live in different places for extended periods of time. He worked in finance. And what had ended up happening was that my sister and I, would either join him or not, depending on where we were in the school year. And I ended up spending time in all of those countries and eventually moving to the US with the sense of being very rootless, very almost without any specific identity. By the end of it, when you're a teenager, and you've lived in a bunch of places, the question of where you're from really begins to be amorphous in your head. And then I think as I settled down and put roots down in the US, it became clearer and clearer to me who I was, this Indian immigrant that had sort of had a global exposure to many different cultures. And I think it really helped my career in television, this understanding of the global marketplace and what people wanted to see and how stories lived in different places. But then as a writer, it really shaped my voice as a millennial immigrant who suffers from the loneliness of having lived in various different places, but also the rich cultural help that it gives you, the understanding that people in different cultures operate differently, and that there's so much in the world to learn and look at, and you can't really take sides on what's right and wrong. It teaches you to be a little less black and white than if you really have lived in one culture and think that everything within that atmosphere is the correct way to live.
Do you think it's given you a better grasp of characterization and the multifaceted dimensions that humans have, simply because you've seen so many different types across the world who value so much that's completely different from perhaps your own or the people who you've been with before?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I've met at this point hundreds of human beings from all walks of life, from all ethnicities, as people like me would. And it's shaped my thinking, because every one of those people have sort of, had a different story. And my characters in my novels are frequently people of my generation with a certain acute loneliness that comes of living in the big city and being from elsewhere, but also having found new homes within the families they've created from friendships and landlords and workplaces and lovers. And that is a direct sort of result of my having lived in various places, sometimes with family, sometimes without. I was in graduate school at Columbia University for film and TV, and I was taking some classes with the writers on the third floor. And these were not screenwriters, these were fiction writers. So this was outside of my program. My program allowed me to do screenwriting and producing, but these were the fiction writers, and Columbia let us take some classes with them. And one of those classes was Other People's Secrets by Benjamin Taylor. And it was just this extraordinary, fantastic class that delved into what it meant to know a secret, someone else's, how it shaped your interactions with them. But also we studied novels that were about secrets, family secrets, old secrets, new secrets, the inheritances of secrets that sort of run in your veins, things we genetically inherit that we keep secret. And so when we were reading, and it was a wonderful class because we read widely from Marquez to Rothschild, just at different ends of the spectrum, we thought about what it meant personally to know other people's secrets. And at the end of the class, we were required to write a short essay or a story. And what came out of me was a story about a mother and a daughter. And I was surprised, even shocked by the essay. I had never spoken of those things before. And then when I submitted it, my professor, he certainly assured me there was a novel in there and one that I must write. And that was the start.
So what happens next then? You mentioned, I mean, it's so grand, but you mentioned the process of outlining, not necessarily sticking to it. And this is your debut, so you're learning as you're going. What were you asking yourself? How were you formatting an outline or ad hoc on the hoof, really?
I didn't for the debut. For the second novel, I really sort of went into outline in a deep way. But for the debut, I wrote 50 pages of rambling. I didn't quite know how to write a novel, and I just poured my heart out for 50 pages. And it was so little of that made its way into the eventual novel, but I wrote it out and I gave it to a novelist friend, and he looked at it and he said, there's something in here, but you have to give it some structure and think about the bones of the story you want to tell as a novel, not just as a stream of consciousness. And that, a few months after that first outpour, that was when I started outlining and plotting and making sure that each character had their own arc, and understanding the twists and turns of the novel that I was building. It was a large novel, something I wouldn't recommend for a debut, but I really had to get my arms around it in a concrete way. And then once the outline was done, it was like, oh my God, here are chapters, here is an arc. I know how to write this. And I didn't know how to write that, but I did write it. And it took many, many, many drafts and edits of that very long novel to get to where we are today.
When you were told by your author friend that there's something here, but you need to go away, you need to pick it apart and discover what the bones are. For someone utterly inexperienced, as you said, you didn't know how to write a novel at that time, what were you looking out for? How on earth did you know what the bones were, what the essence of the story was, so you could expand on it later?
Yeah. And I think I would be remiss to not mention that both my professor with the original essay and my friend with these rambling 50 pages were both very taken by the material. They were experienced authors who saw something that propelled them to urge me. They certainly said words that I will never forget, that made me believe in myself. And that was a big part of it. I don't think that you need that in order to have faith in your work, but I think it's good to get some reads that, someone has to love your novel, and there will always be someone who does not, but you are writing as much for yourself as your readers eventually. And it helped that they both loved the glimmer of what they saw. So that was a part of it. But then after that, it was really about sitting down and understanding it. I really did. That was maybe where the Post-its worked. I really did plot it out chapter by chapter before I made a single move to write a page. I had that outline ready to go, and I shared that with my author friend as well.
It's interesting about you learning as you go. When you're writing this type of fiction, it's as you said, literary. It's not necessarily genre-led. It's not like you're writing a thriller where the purpose of that is defined. If it's a mystery, you need to find the killer. What was it? I guess, what were you writing this story for? Is it what kept you going back every day to explore more of the idea and the characters? What was it about it that prompted you to do all this?
Yeah. The first book, the debut, is very much centered around a young Indian American publishing world, sort of executive. She's a books editor, and she lives in Brooklyn, and she makes millennial choices about her career, her friendships, her lovers. And one day something incredibly unexpected happens to her, and she's thrust back into the world that she comes from in India, in Kolkata specifically. And I had an intimate understanding of the way these legacy families of Bengal worked and sort of thought. The women in my novel are women who are composites of other women that I've known intimately. I wanted to write a book about the cultures of silence that these families were shrouded in, but I also wanted to write a book about what it meant truly to be an immigrant who was also a millennial, who didn't take life very seriously, but who's thrust back in a world that forces her to reckon with her ideologies that have been sort of shape-shifting as it is. You know, she's 29 when we meet her, and, you know, she's casual about a lot of things, including work and her lovers and her friendships, and yet she takes it all seriously enough and gives it importance enough that it looks like a real life. But then when she goes back to India, there is this real sort of, oh, I don't know who I fully am until I've reckoned with this piece of myself. And that structure, that world made me obsessive about returning to it time and time again. It's what fueled me, the understanding of that world, but I had to write the book, you know. And I will say that when it's an undertaking like this, you have to want to really write that book for it to be worth it.
How much did you know about that exploration while you were doing it? So if the questions that you're asking about being an immigrant millennial who's kind of gone through all this and figuring it out, how much did that completely alter your impression of the answers you thought you knew?
Me as author and the protagonist as character. Yeah, that's a great question. I was talking about this in another podcast recently, where Lila, who's the protagonist of Magnificent Ruins, is so reckless, you know, and she's younger than I am. But I've been that age once, not so long ago. And it's interesting because initially you're writing your character as you understand them to be. This is their social background. This is where she lives. This is the restaurant she goes to. You know, this is the world she will be ejected into. And this is kind of the way she thinks. But then as you write, you find your characters taking on a life of their own, right? They're talking to you a little bit. And so Lila really ended up making some morally ambiguous choices that I would have balked at as a person in her shoes. But that as a writer, I was like, oh, right, this is on brand for you. This is where you're going with it. And she really does dive headfirst. But she also pulls back when you've gone too far. And that's, again, something that I don't know most people would, sort of having gone that far, you know, make a very courageous about turn, which I think Lila does towards the end of the book. And she's also funnier than I am. And that was really interesting coming to it as a writer, as a debut writer, where I was taken aback by how much humor this character had to have had to make sense of the world, the various worlds she occupied. You've
picked apart how studying the process of writing has affected who you are and what you do. Writing your first novel so over such a long period of time, and now moving on, and everything has to be a bit more focused and forced, as we said, as you become published. What has writing and getting the first novel edited to a high standard and going through all of that, what has that taught you about how you work best?
I've had the luxury of an incredible agent who's also an editorial agent, and the luxury of an incredible editor. The combination of that, plus having other people read my work and really holding this hardcover in my hands. The book isn't out yet. And just to have this copy sit here and be a thing in the world, that's given me the confidence to be like, I've done this once and people have responded to it. I can do this again. And so when my second book, I had a long runway. I sold the first book, about 18 months before it's going to come out. I had a lot of time where I had an idea that I had germinated again years ago. And the things that were happening to me in real life sort of made my understanding of that idea more concrete. I'm being very vague, but, it's a story about two half-sisters. And it was really interesting to sort of make more note now, having written one thing. My powers of observation changed about families, about blended families, about the way people made their choices. And when this time I was very regimented with outlining it. And people read the outline before I moved forward into novel. But I will say that that first novel gives you sort of a jolt, a confidence, the idea of how to go from chapter to chapter without second guessing yourself. You second guess yourself plenty, or I do anyway. But there is this idea that I have done this once. I've seen light at the end of this tunnel once. I'm going to figure it out.
Thank you so much to Nayantara Roy for coming on the show. The new novel is The Magnificent Ruins. If you'd like to support the show with that novel, you can do that by buying a copy over on our bookshop.org Writers Routine store there, uk.bookshop.org/shop/Writers Routine. It's a lot to remember. I'll stick it in the episode notes. By getting it there, you're supporting, the podcast, Nayantara, and your local independent bookshop. So 3 things that you're supporting. The money isn't just going to the big monopolies, so I always think that's a good thing. Back next week with a brand new episode of the show. In the meantime, you can support us on Patreon or Ko-Fi. I've stuck links in the episode notes wherever you're listening, and make the most of Faber Academy's Writing a Novel course. It's back for 2025. They are sponsoring the show this week. You can find out more faberacademy.com/writing-a-novel. Search for it online. Again, the link is in the episode notes, and I will see you next week with a brand new episode of the podcast. Until then, bye-bye.